So for our first look here at the Dash app, can you please open the Dash Applications notebook located in your course content folder? So with this, I want to touch on in this first recording a few of the Dash core components, Bootstrap components, and how we're launching the server. So this is just creating basic graphics. We're going to ignore some of our function calls and creations here, and we're going to focus on the graphical representation. With all of our applications, obviously we're importing our libraries, so the ones that are going to be important for this section and what we're learning are here at the Dash components. So each of these Dash component lines where we're pulling in different modules, importing our Dash, our tables, core components, HTML components, and then our Bootstrap components, which are going to allow us to place these different items onto our graphical interface. So before we jump in and show you what's going on in the code, please refer to a couple helpful websites, ones that are very helpful in our Bootstrap components web interface that has, website that has, a really robust set of documents that help you understand each of the components that are available to you, the stylization choices, and also the Dash core components. So this is something that is, it's got everything under the sun that you could probably want to ever add to a dashboard, and we're only going to cover a very select few. So this is a very powerful site that shows you how to create graphical representations, any kind of inputs, text fields, anything you can possibly imagine that'll go into your Dash app. This is where you want to look. So this will give you tutorials on Dash, how to start applications, how to call not just core components but HTML components, how to put information into each of those components, what the format is, what you're able to stylize with it. So a great site, very, very robust with documentation, and if you can understand where this is coming from and what you can create, the sky's the limit. The Bootstrap side, what we started with here, Bootstrap is actually a helpful tool in that it takes out some of the complexity when it comes to visualizations and how you have to stylize the graphics. So me personally, I'm not a big fan of the style. I want something that looks okay, something that I can track and easily trace with my eyes, but outside of that, I just want the data. I want to be able to analyze it. So focusing on indents and colors, choices with primary buttons, and making sure I'm defining it to the nth degree is not very appealing to me, and that's where the Bootstrap components come into play. A lot of different components here as far as making it easy to add in buttons, cards, input groups, drop downs, navigation bars, and more simplistic format. I would say there's gives and takes to this. The Dash Bootstrap components, I would say, are more limited to what you can input, how you can interact. A little more difficult on the coding side if you want to update drop downs, things of that nature, but it's all doable. But this, again, for me, is something that just kind of takes away some of that complexity, and is very helpful for me. For example, if I want to just create a button, just putting a button in and making sure it's a primary button or a secondary so that I can quickly define colors. And the way they do that is with a set of what they call their style sheets, or their themes. I'm sorry. So the themes that you can pull in that make it more simplistic. So you can see some of the examples of what those are in Cerulean, Cosmo, Cyborg, Darkly, and the one I'm choosing for this is Space Lab, and this just defines all those characteristics and style themes to make it easier on our users. All right, with that little bit of background, again, familiarize yourself with these, but with that background, let's go ahead and jump into what we're doing and the first part of the lesson. So again, the important part, Dash components. So the first line I want to call to your attention is here at the beginning. So here we're defining a variable that we're calling app, and we're making it equal to our Dash application dot dash, and then we're adding an external style sheet where we're going to reference our DBC, or our Dash Bootstrap components, themes, and then our Space Lab theme. So this is going to this is our call to assign and start our Dash our Dash app itself, and then give it a theme so that we can start to pull in our Bootstrap components stylization that we've defined with our Space Lab selection. All right, so the next couple important pieces. So let's skip past the code section of this. So this is, all the code that we're going to use to run on this. This is all that's going to provide our inputs to our graphic, but we want to skip over and we're just going to focus on the graphics themselves and that layout piece. So down a little lower, we're going to actually start defining our layout, our Dash layout, and with that you're going to see this call where we have our app that is already assigned here, and then we're going to start defining the layout. So each of these are referring to different components that we're going to place onto our graphics. So from here to here, we've got the definition of all of our visualizations. So I'm going to go ahead and actually start this, and then click once this loads through. If you want to start and follow along, you're going to select this web address that comes up here, or this IP address I should say, where it will actually host our application. We're going to go ahead and let this launch and let it load, and then we're going to walk through a couple of these components. Alright, so inside of this we are going to define several different things. First, we are going to define the main body, and then down below that, this is our first definition of an item where we will be using an HTML type item, so our Dash HTML components, to define just a text header. So H1 is a text header. If you look through some of the Bootstrap and core components, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, they're all referring to different types of headers that you're going to reference throughout your code, and you can even see we use other types of headers in H2 and for our different headers here. But here we define our first header as Dash applications, and you can see when we pull up the Dash app that here is our header that we're defining. Next, for myself, I usually add line breaks so that I can add extra spacing. There are pads you can add to this so that you can increase the spacing within the call here, but I typically, just preference, I'll add a line break in there to create this additional space to give it a little bit of a cleaner look and to be a little easier for my eyes to draw upon. From there, we're going to define a table. I'm not going to cover that yet. We're going to cover that in probably the next video, but we're going to define a table, and that object is here. And within that table, we're going to have a bunch of selections, which we'll cover shortly. Next, we've got our H2, which is our close price header that you see here. After our DCC.graph. So this is a Dash core component graph, so DCC Dash core component graphic, that we're going to define as close being the ID, so the ID is close, and the figure we're going to populate with is close figure, that we will go over in our next section when we get to graphics, which will discuss how we're calculating that close figure. But we're basically telling this graphic, I want to populate you with an ID and a figure. H2, we're going to define our header here as metrics figure, and in DCC.graph we are going to define an ID again in metrics and give it a figure in metrics figure, which we calculated up here. So you can see these are present as well, and we are going to define how we create these figures in the next couple sections. But the important pieces again are just these simple layout components. We're going to get more into some of these other sections when we add buttons. I'm going to show you more around the DBC components. I just want you to understand where we're defining the graphics, how you're creating that layout, and it's all within this one section. Me personally, again, I don't like a bunch of coding. You'll see, different style efforts and choices, very similar to what you got with the Dash table. So this Dash table, you got a lot of complexity here as compared to putting in a graphic with the call here, at least on the update for the Dash line, or adding this in. When we get into more of the complex calls here later, you'll see a little bit more of what I'm talking about. But just again, important to note the launch clause so far. where we're defining our dash layout here, so defining the dash layout, each of the components on there, and then lastly where we're adding our server clause to actually start the application. So this is looking for our app here, and we're going to start running it. So our main launch clause here is looking for a name, and from there it's going to start our app.run server to start our actual application running. Alright, so with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into our next section where we will be covering how we populate our data table. So giving a little more background on this, the calls we're using, where we're grabbing our momentum information, and then how we update this table.